Post the US presidential election, I guess the whole world are equally divided. And some are very surprised that former US President Donald Trump is going to return to the White House. And more people are very concerned regarding his domestic policy as well as the policies for international relationships. But meanwhile, other group of people are very concerned regarding the concept of democracy. And for example, are we still seeing this gender equality and also the protection for the illegal immigrants to the country? You know, for so long that on this program that we've been talking about the importance and also the significance of democracy around the world. For example, we talk about the US, we talk about the nation of North Korea, and also more countries in the Middle East. If we pay closer attention today, more countries around the world at the end of the year, should we say, have already started this transition or transformation towards more democratic system. But how should we understand the value of democracy today? And particularly today, we need to look at the country of Tunisia. Some experts believe that today, not only that we need to talk about the concept of democracy, and also we need to understand this correlation between democratic system and also this political fairness and also this economic agenda. What is or what are the differences between democracy and also authoritarian or autocracy today? Why are they relevant still to most of the citizens around the world? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Sabina Henneberg. Dr. Henneberg is a Soref Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Henneberg, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Henneberg, such an honor to have you on our show today. Now, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is called How Autocracy Prevailed in Tunisia and Why Any Future Democratic Renewal Will Depend on an Entirely New Movement. Let's get to the first fundamental question, Dr. Henneberg. When we look at the concept of democracy today, again, it's not just about this word democracy. It's linked to the economic agenda and also political fairness within the country. You're the expert. When we look at Tunisia today, what is the definition of autocracy, and why do you think this is so crucial for us to understand when we talk about the system within the country?
Well, I guess to consider the question of what democracy or autocracy means in the eyes of most Tunisians, we can start by remembering what Tunisians were demanding when they took to the streets in late 2010 and early 2011. The main slogans were about, well, first of all, the fall of the regime, which they saw as, corrupt, and also they had chanted slogans about bread, jobs, and dignity, national dignity. So you sort of tried to distinguish between political fairness and an economic agenda, and I do think those are both aspects of what democracy would mean in Tunisia. Part of the reason that Tunisia has experienced the sort of autocratization or democratic backsliding that we wrote about in the article over the last few years is because there was no delivery after 2011 of those economic demands. If anything, the economy has gotten worse. International economists or economic experts describe what has been happening since 2011 as a lost decade. But similarly, there has been no concrete changes in the political system, especially the idea that the people kind of making the decisions in Tunisia are corrupt and sort of reaping the benefits of any decisions they take without sharing them kind of among the Tunisian people. So those are the things I would point to.
Well, again, Dr. Henneberg, let's keep our conversation going. In the article that you specifically mentioned, The lack of sufficient foreign aid as a critical factor in Tunisia's dilemma. Now, the next question is, what specific type of aid were most needed, and how could the international community have better targeted their support to avoid bolstering authoritarianism today?
Well, along the lines of what we just discussed, I would say that the basic thing that was missing from international support to Tunisia after 2011 was economic support. But it's important to acknowledge that that wasn't necessarily easy to deliver. Tunisians at the time were asking for a lot. They were talking about a Marshall Plan for Tunisia, or a free trade agreement, which is something that the United States only has. And I'm really talking about Tunisian engagement with the United States here, because that's the sort of aspect of international assistance that I know the best. The United States only has a free trade agreement with something like 14 countries at all, and Tunisia is not particularly big or economically important. So Tunisians were asking for things that weren't necessarily realistic. Still, it seems to me that international assistance to Tunisia ended up prioritizing political change over economic change and economic assistance. For example, there were policies that the United States enacted early on about providing what are called loan guarantees to Tunisia. I think something like more of these, or maybe more and bigger loan guarantees would have been something that could have kind of helped kind of carry Tunisia through a really tumultuous period. But I guess as I'm trying to illustrate, there are no easy answers. There were no easy answers for the international community at the time. Still, something like expanded, support for the private sector might have made a difference.
Now, let's talk about the current leader for Tunisia. I mean, again, Dr. Henneberg, you're the expert, but within the political science field that we tend to say people are the product of the environment. And of course that we've seen that the current president, that again, throughout the social media and also throughout the media coverage, that as we mentioned before, citizens were anticipating major political shift, and also they were looking for, air quote, personalities really to change the country. So my next question, let's go back to another fundamental concern is, how should we describe the personality or even this political ambition under the current president of Tunisia? And also, why do you think that his political charm or his economic agenda or everything together are still facing backlash or still being criticized, and particularly within the parties and also among the younger generations? And one thing that we know, that when we look at the current political system in the US, younger generations throughout the entire presidential election played a major role, regardless if you're on the Republican side or on the Democratic side. But there's no denying that younger generations are very bold and also extremely active in participation for this political movement. So going back to the question, what are the major criticism for the current president, and why do you think that despite all the changes and also all the effort, what are the answers exactly that younger generations are looking for? Is it political reform? Is it economic agenda? Or is it for social changes? Your thoughts?
Okay. Well, first, I guess maybe it'd be helpful to remind listeners a little bit about what has kind of happened under this current president, Kais Saied, who was, elected in a process observed by international bodies in September 2019. And then he was just reelected this past October in a much more kind of closed electoral environment. But in between those two things, the big event that sort of marked the beginning of the real change under Kais Saied took place on July 25th, 2021. And that was when Kais Saied sort of suddenly froze Parliament and took steps to essentially consolidate power more and more into his own hands. So you talked about, perceptions of Kayside and support and what people are looking for. At the time, it's important to remember the context. July 2021, COVID was rampant in Tunisia. Inflation was really high. People were so fed up with the leadership. The prime minister at the time, I think there were sort of photographs of him circulating of him in his vacation house while people back at home suffered, lounging by the pool or something at his vacation house. So the perception was that all Tunisian politicians were corrupt, and that was exactly the kind of messaging that Kayside was using to justify his actions. He talked about kind of like correcting the course of the revolution and kicking out everybody and bringing something entirely new. And so that's what people really supported. And I do think that's still what people are looking for. But now it's been more than 3 years since those events and more than 5 years since Kayside became president. So I want to highlight that his support, he still has somewhat significant support, but it has waned for a couple reasons. First of all, because the economy hasn't really improved. Daily lives of Tunisians haven't really improved. And it's not, I think a lot of people may feel that it's not clear what his plan is for Tunisia, especially in terms of the economy. He does things like talk about taxing the rich and taking back money that was stolen from the state and things, but it hasn't been fully or very much delivered on. And people are also realizing what a change how much change Kayside has brought in terms of individual liberties. It's important to remember that freedom of expression and human rights more generally were considered big gains of the post-2011 years. And under Kayside, it's been clear that he doesn't have any intention to preserve those freedoms. So in September 2021, so just a couple months after his major, what a lot of people describe as a coup or a self-coup, Kayside decreed something called Decree 117, essentially that he was freezing and kind of taking over all kinds of regulatory bodies and things like the media. And so that was the first sign for people that maybe he was going a little too far in terms of, violating the law in the name of restoring the course of the revolution. A lot of people talk about the importance of civil society in Tunisia, or I would say particularly in sort of certain years after 2011. Since 2011, civil society in Tunisia has been governed by a law known as Decree 88, and members of civil society really value that law. They think it really protects their freedoms without kind of opening up Tunisia to unnecessary risks. And Kayside has talked a lot about reforming that law and basically restricting civil society a lot more. So those are the kinds of things that have really begun to worry people, and they no longer, he no longer has the support that he once had. I don't want to give the idea, I don't think he faces like a lot of criticism right now. I think the more general feeling in Tunisia, among Tunisians, including young people, is just apathy. Like people are looking for a way to leave. A lot of Tunisians have been leaving. And even those who are kind of active and taking to the streets, I mean, first of all, they're operating in an environment that's much more, frightening than in previous years. And they're just not necessarily mobilizing against him in the numbers that they once mobilized against Ben Ali more than 10 years ago. That's sort of how I would describe perceptions of Kayside up until now and kind of some of the key events.
Dr. Henneberg, let's talk about another term that in the article is called a democratic renewal. If I calculated right, the beginning of the year that experts predicted that more than 100 countries around the world this year would undergo this democratic transformation or a major elections. And again, the goal is to pass the finishing line and again, eventually reach democracy. Of course, we know that this is a procedure and this is a gradual procedure to reach the purpose. Now, coming back to the nation of Tunisia, how should we understand this concept of democratic renewal? I mean, again, what does that signify to the country? I know that you mentioned and also thoroughly explained regarding this economic change, this political system, and also this criticism among the people. But just to understand the future for the country, to renew something, which means to rejuvenize, which means we need to provide, perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, a fresh take or even a bold move, start a movement, whatever that could create an impact. So from your perspective, what can we expect just to look ahead for Tunisia? And how should we understand this type of concept of democratic renewal? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, just to, I guess, clarify how I see the concept of democracy and the concept of democratization, one important aspect, I don't really see it as something that is like an end point that a country has achieved, and it's not sort of a constant work in progress. I think, Will, you invoked the United States a moment ago. I think we see that here in the debates here about what does democracy mean. It means different things to different people at different times. So in that sense, I guess just maybe I would highlight a couple of things in terms of what might be steps towards a democratic renewal in Tunisia. I mean, not to I guess beat a dead horse, for an expression I don't use very often, but I, suppose any sustainable system in Tunisia would need, and any sustainable new leadership in Tunisia would need a new economic strategy. Kai Said has talked about things like making Tunisia self-sufficient. He really emphasizes Tunisia's sovereignty, but hasn't, again, kind of like the way he talks about ending corruption, hasn't gone a long way hasn't gone too far in really delivering on those or making more concrete that strategy. And I think we mentioned in the article that, as time goes on, he's, first of all, has less and less of a claim to be a fresh face. I can't remember if I mentioned before that was another sort of point he used to galvanize support, especially in July 2021, that he was an outsider. He was a law professor. He wasn't from this political class. I think he even kind of tried to refuse to live in the presidential palace after he was elected. He was, insisted that he's one of the people and still does, but he's now been president for more than 5 years. He's becoming more and more part of the system, the political system. And also he fires so many people around him and has so few kind of people advising him that it's becoming harder and harder for him to scapegoat, other actors in the political system. So in short, it doesn't seem like Kai Said is going to be able to deliver this new economic strategy that could help be part of a renewal in Tunisia. Yeah, and then to go back to your first question, I think it would just require that Tunisians feel like they have a voice. I mentioned when they took to the streets in 2010, 2011, that the slogans about jobs, bread, and dignity, I'm not sure if people really even knew what they meant by dignity, other than this idea that people at the top were getting rich without sharing it with the rest of the country. But, that is a fundamental tenet of democracy, that people have a voice. And I suppose, nothing would be sustainable in Tunisia without that.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Henneberg, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, going back to the article towards the end, this is what you wrote, and I quote, "Although embattled Tunisians may feel worn down by the president's repression, they and the West must not succumb to disillusionment. I mean, again, as we know that looking ahead after this major presidential election in the US, foreign policy will continue to dominate the news headlines. And also foreign policy will continue to play a major role under President Donald Trump. But meanwhile, we need to understand when we look at what Tunisians are experiencing today, and also see the changes and with anticipation and also expectations, what role, Dr. Henneberg, from your perspective, can we expect the West to play? I mean, again, it's one of the crucial countries. I mean, at this moment, I think it's safe to say that post the pandemic, no leader should ever underestimate the power of relationship, or no leader should ever overlook the contribution of international friends or international friendships, regardless from this political spectrum or from this economic interest. So from your perspective, what do we understand, or how do we see that the West will continue to engage with Tunisia and also to continue to help the country to foster more equitable and a sustainable democratic system or democratic value? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can't predict the future. A couple things. I totally agree with you that it's unsafe to disregard the value of a relationship with a country like Tunisia. It might be small, but it's right at the heart of North Africa, and neighboring regions like the Sahel are increasingly experiencing instability, along with Tunisia's neighbors like Libya. Have been dealing with upheaval and uncertainty for a long time. I'm not sure that the incoming president of the United States will consider it important to kind of uphold and maintain a strong relationship with Tunisia. I think the most likely thing is he won't, care much at all about Tunisia or do much to invest in any kind of renewal of democracy there. I think some of the tenets of a more productive relationship with Tunisia would have to involve things like, we've talked about economic support, investing in its education system, which, was once fairly robust, but kind of deteriorated under Ben Ali and isn't really preparing graduates now for the jobs they need, and going into the private sector. And then there's Europe. When you talk about the West, at least when we're talking in the context of Tunisia, it's important to distinguish between the US and Europe, because Tunisia will just probably never be as important for the United States as it is for Europe, which is much closer. And where now for several years, the chief concern has been about kind of containing migration coming from Tunisia. So if I had to guess, I would expect that to remain the chief concern for Europe, and the approach to that, which is basically to try to promise Tunisia more money if they can help contain migrants, even if it kind of or entirely violates their human rights. Wouldn't really expect that to take a dramatic turn anytime soon, but if new somehow or enlightened leadership in Europe wanted to help support a more democratic Tunisia, I would point to the same things: economic support, education, and also trying to support the human rights network, both inside the country and now increasingly abroad. I think those networks actually played a role in the events of 2011 and the immediate aftermath that helped, kind of prevent the country from falling into crisis. So it would be important to continue supporting that right now.
Well, again, Dr. Henneberg, we don't really know what will happen under President Trump. Again, when you look at the foreign policy and also look at the international relationships. But meanwhile, it is crucial to acknowledge the younger generations in Tunisia, what they're looking for, and also what they're expecting for the changes for this upcoming year. And again, we know that, as we mentioned before, no country can single work or single handedly just being run by dictators. And we believe that this could happen to any other country. But for Tunisia, it is still important that we need to preserve and also understand and appreciate the value of democracy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Sabina Henneberg. Again, Dr. Henneberg is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Well, Dr. Henneberg, and thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. And again, we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes, and not just about what happened or what is happening in the nation of Tunisia, and also really about the matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.